Good evening. So I'm here to introduce our guest tonight, but first a note about this reading series. The Kestnbaum Writer-in-Residence series is a program that is made possible by the Kestnbaum Family Cultural Activities Fund. This endowment was created by Gertrude Kestnbaum in 1967 to memorialize her husband, Meyer. And today, the Kestnbaum Writers-in-Residence program is one of the highlights of the Committee on Creative Writing, allowing the campus community to connect with notable authors and their work. The family remain generous supporters, and we would like to recognize Kate Kestnbaum, recently deceased. She was a life member of the visiting committee to the Division of the Humanities. We also want to recognize Kate's daughter, Ellen Kestnbaum Daniels, who is here with us today. Thank you once again for your ongoing investment in the students and faculty at the University of Chicago and all your family has done to facilitate their engagement with the arts over the past several decades. And now I'm here to introduce Ben Lerner to the stage. He will give a reading, and afterwards he'll take questions from the audience. Ben Lerner is a poet and novelist. His 3 books of poetry are The Lichtenberg Figures, Angle of Yaw, and Mean Free Path. His 3 works of fiction are Leaving the Etosha Station, 1004, and the Topeka School. His many awards and distinctions include the Guggenheim Fellowship, the MacArthur Genius Grant, and the LA Times Book Prize. I first encountered Ben's work about a decade ago in his debut novel, Leaving the Etosha Station. Set in the post-9/11 years of heightened paranoia, the novel chronicles Adam Gordon, a young American poet on fellowship abroad in Madrid. Despite his artistic inclinations, he is afraid of being, as he puts it, incapable of having a profound experience of art, a fear that he attempts to assuage by walking to the Prado Museum every morning and studying Rohi van der Weyden's Descent from the Cross, among other images of suffering and violence. It's during this fellowship year that Adam becomes an unwitting witness to a catastrophic event when he stumbles past the Etosha train station on the morning of its bombing, a real-life terrorist act that took place on March 11, 2004. When I first read the book, I had the distinct sensation of encountering a contemporary novel for the first time. I don't mean that I saw myself and my peers in the book, although I did. It was more that the narration, written in the first person from Adam's perspective, felt new to me in the portrayal of consciousness attempting to mediate reality. In the hours following the Etosha Station bombing, Adam reads about the event on the New York Times website. He calls his parents, he attempts to give blood, he joins a demonstration, he brainstorms with a gallerist on how its exhibit can best commemorate this tragedy. He is both in the present and looking at this event from the vantage point of history. The shock of catastrophe, its suffering and violence, is subsumed in this active metabolizing. We live in what seems like the age of catastrophe, but often without a sense of emergency. The Instagram scroll that brings me shopping recommendations also brings me images of war, devastation in Ukraine. It's the same scroll that 2 years ago brought me pictures of friends at home baking efforts, inches away from public service diagrams on masking and hand washing techniques. The large and the small, the local and the global, the personal and the political are flattened onto the same plane, onto the same narrative field. Published in 2011, Leaving the Etosha Station, like much of Ben's writing, feels ahead of its time. And I am reminded once again that we don't read fiction to escape reality, we read fiction to better perceive it. Please join me in welcoming Ben Lerner.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for that generous and eloquent introduction. Thank you to the Kestnbaums for making this all possible, to Chiku, to Starsha, to you all for coming. I want to read an alarmingly new thing. I mainly feel like I should read it because I'm so afraid to read it, just because it's new and it's embarrassing. So I'm gonna just dig into that, and then we can talk. Okay. And I might abandon it at some point and read some prose poems. I'll just see how it goes. I have a backup plan. When I became a father, I began to worry not only that I would die and not be able to care for my daughter, but that I would die in an embarrassing way. That my death would be an abiding embarrassment for Astra, that in some future world, assuming there is a future, she will be on a date with someone, hard as that is for me to imagine, and her date will ask, "What does your father do?" And she will say, "He died when I was little," and her date will respond, "I'm sorry," hesitate, and then ask in a bid for intimacy how I died. And Astra will feel ashamed, will look down into her blue wine, there will be blue wine in the future, and say, "He had an aneurysm on the toilet," which is one of the ways I often fear that I might die. I'm sure she'd withhold the toilet part, at least on a first date, but that would just make it worse, would amplify the shame. If I were to die on the toilet tomorrow, I assume Ilu wouldn't share many specifics with Astra, who, like many 3-year-olds, finds everything relating to the potty fascinating and hilarious. But as Astra grew older, she would want to know more about the circumstances of my death, at which point Ilu would have to lie or divulge the details. Ilu would, I'm confident, eventually tell Astra the truth. In fact, I can imagine a version of the conversation that's tender, sweet. Ilu finally tells Astra it happened on the toilet, let's say reading on the toilet. There is an awkward moment of silence. Then they both start laughing, then they both start crying, embracing each other, laughing and crying, remembering me as a well-meaning fool who projected or tried to project some seriousness as a poet, as a person, but who in fact met an appropriately ridiculous death. Silly dada, as Astra always says. So maybe it wouldn't be that bad for Astra. To be able to laugh at your father is a kind of gift, perhaps the biggest gift a father can give. But I worried that if I died on the toilet or in some other ignominious way when Astra was still very young and Astra had little or no conscious memory of me, then I would, in her mind, be totally identified with the manner of my demise. My entire life, at least for her, would contract to the punchline of my death. At every point of his life, Benjamin writes, a man who dies at 35 will have been a man who dies at 35. At every point of his life, a man who dies on the toilet will have been a man who was going to die on the toilet. His poems will be the poems of a man who dies on the toilet. His loves, his causes, his crises, the loves and causes and crises of the man destined to leave the world on the toilet. And a man who chokes to death at 40 on a piece of steak at Café Lou will have been at every point that man. And while choking to death isn't as bad as dying on the toilet, there is still something disgraceful about it, especially if you're a little fat as I am, if you eat too fast and talk too much as I do, so that your death is the death of a slob, a word I was 9 or 10, heard an elegant aunt of mine use to describe me when she thought I was out of earshot, catalyzing a full-bodied experience of shame I can feel the echo of now. Slob, less a word you pronounce than a sonic object you disgorge. And to die by choking, especially choking on animal flesh, is linked to the toilet, is involved with digestion and elimination, which is part of the humor and power of the scene in Buñuel's The Phantom of Liberty, where the guests at a dinner party, if that's what it's called, are seated around a table on toilets and have to discreetly excuse themselves to the dining room to eat as quickly as possible in privacy. When I began to choke, maybe because I'd been laughing at something Aaron had said, or because I'd taken too large a bite, or because I'd failed to chew my food sufficiently, which is more likely to happen when you've been drinking, my epiglottis, the flap of cartilage that covers the opening of the trachea when you swallow, failed to close in time, and the piece of steak lodged there, blocking all airflow to my lungs. I felt tremendous shame. Shame spread through me as I sat, startled, entirely unable to breathe, the steak having formed a perfect seal, as if it had been precisely measured to stop my windpipe, a word that has always troubled me that makes it sound like we're mere instruments, chimes. While Aaron went on talking, I glanced around the packed restaurant to see if anybody else knew my secret. At one table, an older couple was reading their menus by the light of their phones. At another, a woman with bare shoulders was holding a hand out towards her companion, displaying a ring. I thought I saw a diamond sparkle above the candle. As if to buy time, I took a small sip of my wine. My water glass was empty, but there was nowhere for the wine to go. I let it trickle into my napkin, which I returned to my lap. All the while, I was trying to conceal my condition, which was insane, as I should have been alerting Aaron immediately to my choking, but I had the confused if intense sense that if I didn't acknowledge the reality of my choking, I'd be fine, and while I was terrified of my shameful secret being discovered, I did not yet register the fear of dying, although I sensed the fear was coming. I sensed a deep ancestral panic was taking form, but it wasn't inside me. It was not yet mine. I pictured, as I sat staring at Aaron without hearing him, that the panic was gathering itself in Union Square, the southeast corner of Union Square, a violently rotating column of air collecting and scattering leaves and trash, now traveling toward me through the spring night. It was at this point, maybe 10 seconds had passed, that I began to write this in my head, by which I mean I started to narrate my choking to myself, as if transforming it into a story would keep me connected to a future in which I might tell it, and I started to audition different analogies for that horribly decisive moment when the stake stopped my windpipe, analogies that would emphasize how it felt less like an accident had occurred than that an operation had been successfully performed, a shuttle docking at a space station, a bullet sliding into a chamber, a prophecy being fulfilled. All of the analogies were wrong, but that was good. That meant I could go on auditioning them, postponing my death, keeping the tornado of fear from finding the restaurant, my table. Take all the time you need, a voice said in my head, Mrs. Hackett's voice, my first grade teacher at Randolph Elementary. She said it each time she gave us a writing prompt. I'd involuntarily summoned Mrs. Hackett because she was rumored to have once saved a child who was choking on a piece of hard candy by stabbing him in the throat with a pencil, performing an emergency tracheotomy, which had always remained for me a vividly, a variously imagined primal scene in which the writing implement is both an instrument of violence and of care, where the teacher is both an assailant and savior. There were no doubt complex sexual fantasies and fears embedded in this story. The pencil is phallus, the opening of a new orifice. I'd read that you're everyone in your dreams, and I'd always imagined myself as both the teacher and the child in this dreamlike scene, my consciousness distributed across the bodies, but also the objects, the pencil, the candy lodged in the child's throat. It was hard to explain. I was going to need a lot of time to tease out the implications, but miraculously, given that I couldn't breathe, I could take all the time I needed. Part of me was at my table in Café Lou, turning pale, staring unseeingly and unhearingly at Aaron, but part of me rose from my desk and walked to the pencil sharpener attached to the wall, and that part of me could smell the cedar shavings as I turned the little crank, could hear the birds in the walnut tree beside the half-open window. I walked back to my desk and sat down and carefully wrote my name in my recently acquired cursive, blowing to disperse the trace amounts of graphite. But when I looked up to check the date, Mrs. Hackett always wrote it on the chalkboard. I saw Aaron's face, saw that Aaron had asked me a question, and now for the first time I tried to speak. Spinoza wrote that the aleph, the first and silent letter of the Hebrew alphabet, is the sound of opening the throat as if to speak and not speaking. And if the last letter of the alphabet were also silent, it should be a sign to the non-sound I made when I tried to speak, to make any noise at all in response to whatever it was that Aaron had asked. Whatever the densest, purest form of silence is, the sound of closing the throat, the black hole of silence that sucks everything you've ever said or might have said into it, that was the non-sound I made when no air escaped through my windpipe, and I no longer felt that I could keep my choking secret, no longer felt that I had time, and that's when the panic entered the restaurant. It wasn't a tornado now, it was spilling across the floor like flame on oil, and it touched me. When I became a father, I secretly gave myself permission to kill myself if anything ever happened to my daughter. And I even selected a spot near the Brooklyn side of the Manhattan Bridge where I would jump if something did happen, a place to which I could rush, staying ahead of the pain. I'd hail a cab and run onto the bridge and scale the ineffectual chain link fence and leap and lose consciousness when I hit the dark water. I would like to think I would not actually kill myself, that I wouldn't do that to Elu, to my family and friends, but it was a vivid and comforting image, this particular spot on the bridge. It comforted me to picture it when I couldn't sleep and was ruminating about SIDS or fascists or rising seas. It comforted me during the night we spent in the ER because she was wheezing, or more recently when she fell down the stairs in our building and was fine. When I tried to speak and could not, this was half a minute into my choking, the image of the water, the moving image, the live stream of that particular patch of black water I'd selected or that had selected me appeared vividly in my mind, and I was internally commanded, as if the father in Kafka's The Judgment had screamed, "I condemn you to death by drowning," except I was both the father and the son in this version, to flee the restaurant and destroy myself so as to avoid choking to death in front of 100 people at Cafe Lou. How much worse it would be for Astra to have a father who killed himself for no apparent reason than one who died by accident, however embarrassing. But as adrenaline flooded my body, I no longer felt compelled to keep my secret quietly at the table. Instead, I felt compelled to get out of the restaurant as quickly as possible, to die on my own terms, away from the gazes of others. Obviously, I would not have had time to travel the 4 or 5 miles to my spot on the bridge, nor would I be able to reach the Hudson, but I could jump in front of a bus, or if there weren't any buses, I could at least expire in the dark, unobserved, as opposed to flailing around and turning purple in Cafe Lou, where somebody might film my death throes on their phone. This impulse to flight, I would later learn, is common and deadly for people who are choking. And now I found myself standing, looking across the packed basement dining room to the door, which seemed to have receded. Aaron thought that I'd stood to greet someone, and so he also rose from his chair, turning around to see who had arrived, and then turning back to me in confusion. For the first time, he now realized something was wrong, and he asked me if I was okay. Later, he told me that, as I brought my hands to my throat to make the universal sign, I had a slight apologetic smile. He asked me, "Are you choking?" I had always been fascinated and slightly disturbed by the question, "Are you choking?" The question you were told to always ask before rendering assistance. There is something funny or cruel about it, because nothing seems to be in less need of verbal clarification than the fact that somebody is incapable of drawing breath. So it's like asking somebody if they're on fire. No, why do you ask? Although I understood there must be various conditions that mimic choking, where you don't want somebody doing abdominal thrusts that might break your ribs, and also that the question functions as a request for consent to intervention. Nevertheless, the question, long before Aaron asked it of me that night in Cafe Lou, haunted me because, paradoxically, the only true way to answer in the affirmative is to be incapable of answering at all. You were taught that if a person who is ostensibly choking says yes, they are not really choking. You are supposed to stay with them, monitor them until they swallow or cough or otherwise expel the obstruction. Logicians talk about the liar's paradox. If you say, "I am lying," and the statement is true, it's false, but if it's false, it's true. This is the choker's paradox, in which the conditions of assent are the incapacity to assent. Yes is a no. Since so much of language is used to obscure the brute realities of bodies and their processes, to cover the real and the symbolic, this scene, where the Good Samaritan asks the choking person if they're choking, became in my mind a ritual acknowledgement of the gap between these two things, the gap, but also the interdependence between physical life, respiring and perspiring and chewing and shitting, and the social world of speech, a division unreliably enforced by a leaf-shaped flap of cartilage. This must be why, ever since Mr. Hessler taught us the steps for assisting a conscious choking adult in our 8th grade health class and made us rehearse them with each other without actually performing the thrusts, which he explained were quite dangerous, what left us with the sense that we should never actually do what he was supposedly preparing us for unless we were trying to inflict harm on an enemy. Mr. Hessler was also the wrestling coach, so that the entire scene became a fraught and confusing mashup of sex, assume the position behind find your partner, and violence and humiliation that had nothing to do with saving anybody, I have always thought there was sadism haunting the question, are you choking? The one who still draws breath and can form it into speech demands from the person who is choking a response he cannot give. In my mind, it also perversely links the emergency protocols for choking with breath play, in which, aside from whatever the physiology of asphyxiation and orgasm might be, there is the erotic drama of being reduced to mere body and then restored to speech. Regardless, choking is a uniquely human drama, a definitional drama for the homo loquens, a drama at the heart of the human, or rather at the larynx, the voice box, which, as we evolved, moved lower and lower, enabling us to generate a long column of vibrating air we can shape into meaning with our mouth parts, shaped air that might in turn build and shape a world. But this evolutionary speech advantage required that the space in our bodies for breathing and swallowing be shared. The formal capacity for speech comes with the risk of choking to death, something only humans really do. Choking and scenes of instruction had always been linked in my mind, not only because of Hackett and Hessler, but also because I associated the ritual posing of a question that can't be answered, the addressing of speech to the helpless non-speaker, with the relation between infant and parent, the parent who talks to the baby as if it might respond, the very first language lesson, often starting in utero, hello little Astra, can you hear me? But she wasn't yet named Astra when we attended, a little more than 3 years before I choked on my steak at Cafe Lou, the infant CPR and safety class Elu's OBGYN recommended. We found ourselves one February night at a table at NYU with 3 other couples and one unaccompanied pregnant woman, while the instructor, a nurse in light blue scrubs, circled us with a cart on which were stacked infant CPR mannequins, asking each couple to take one. Some of the mannequins were brown and some of them were white, and I assumed that the nurse, a white woman, was asking couples to choose their mannequin instead of simply distributing them so people could select the one whose skin color they believed most closely approximated their future offsprings, although nothing about the plastic tonalities looked human. The man and woman who formed the first couple the cart reached were black. They selected a brown mannequin. The next couple consisted of 2 white women, and they selected a white baby. When it was our turn to choose from the nightmarish cart, I leaned back a little to make it clear to Elu that she should decide. She hesitated, and I assumed she was imagining the future pigmentation of our daughter. Would she more closely resemble Elu's coloration or mine? And was Elu's skin color ultimately closer to the brown plastic or the white? It was as if all the future complexity of our interracial family was unfolded in the selection of the dummy, although this might have been only in my mind. Elu chose a brown one. The woman without a partner, I thought she was white, but I wasn't sure, chose a brown baby too and set it down harder than she meant to. The plastic head hit the table with a crack. Once we all had our babies, the nurse sat and began to read from a binder. We were to be congratulated for taking the time to acquire these life-saving techniques. I'd already decided I'd be unable to assimilate any of the information in real time and would have to catch up later with YouTube tutorials, and, as I expected, everything unfolded for me once the actual practicing started in a disorienting whirl. Lay the infant face down across the arm. Deliver 5 sharp blows with your palm between the shoulder blades. But how hard, someone asked. Harder than you'd think, the nurse said. Turn your infant over, place 2 fingers in the center of the doll's chest, quickly compress to at least 1/3 of its depth, approximately 1.5 inches. But how fast, someone asked. A rate of around 100 times a minute, she said. Think of the song Staying Alive. I thought the nurse had made a tasteless joke, but she was serious, repeating, think of the tempo of Staying Alive, which I would later learn is known as the CPR anthem. I wasn't sure I knew how to think of a tempo, if I could be confident I hadn't sped it up or slowed it down, but now the song became a mocking soundtrack in my mind. Tilt the baby's head back to open the airway, cover both the child's mouth and nose with your own mouth, and whisper Staying Alive directly into the infant's brain. In spirit, the dummy, its windpipe, then beseech it to stay. Do not leave me. If you do, I'll jump off the Manhattan Bridge. I have a place in mind. The mannequin tasted like rubbing alcohol. I remember pushing it over to Elu as if it were a strangely shaped bong from which I'd just taken a dizzying hit, but Elu pushed it back. Deliver 2 breaths, the nurse was saying. Each ventilation should last a second. I looked at the couple across the table. They were doing back blows, so I started doing back blows. The nurse was saying something about the compression to ventilation ratio when the woman who didn't have a partner slammed her hands on the table and said, "My fucking baby is dead, okay? I am the worst mother who ever lived." In the ensuing silence, I tried to identify her accent, Greek, Israeli. Everyone was staring at the woman, or trying not to. She was smiling. Or everyone was staring or trying not to stare at the plastic baby she had failed, and now she was crying, but still holding the smile. For a long moment, nobody knew what to do. Then Elu and one of the other women pushed back their chairs and went to her as quickly as their pregnant bellies would allow, offering comfort, support, encouragement. The worst mother who ever lived became one of our most enduring jokes, refrains. We are always, especially when Astra was an infant, calling each other the worst mother who ever lived. I could also be that mother. We claimed that there were only 2 kinds of mothers, the good enough mother and the worst mother who ever lived. If I forgot to buy diapers and I had to go back out, I was the worst mother who ever lived. If Elu nicked Astra while cutting her nail, she was the worst mother who ever lived. It was a useful joke. It helped lighten Elu's tendency towards self-recrimination. It short-circuited the guilt mechanism, laid it bare, and it was good for her to call me a mother, for the impossibly punishing category of mother to be spread around the apartment so that it lost some of its force, so the mother in her head would stop saying, "I condemn you to death by drowning," or whatever Elu's equivalent of that condemnation was. I will never forget that moment of transformation when the sanitized and anxious space of the conference room suddenly became human, how we all scooted our chairs a little closer to the woman, how we all started laughing and joking and talking about how scary and weird this parenting thing would be, how the couple forms dissolved into something larger, however briefly, even the nurse joining us, becoming one of us, showing us pictures of her kids on her phone. This is the troublemaker. Here's one from Halloween, before we all returned to our places around the table when the class resumed, infinitely more collaborative now, although I still couldn't keep the emergency protocols straight, couldn't learn anything except the necessity of repeatedly sweeping your home for choking hazards, as we discussed during the review period when we'd set our dolls aside. Beware of marbles and Legos your older kids might have left around. Beware of screws or washers that might have fallen from your ready-to-assemble furniture, a cashew or piece of gum a grown-up might have inadvertently let fall to the carpet where your child will crawl. And, perhaps most importantly, you must always remember to properly cut your child's food, to cut round foods like hot dogs and grapes lengthwise. The nurse took turns looking us in the eye. You don't know how many lives would be saved if patients would cut their kids' hot dogs lengthwise into strips, then cut them again. And so, in addition to our joke and the memory of the camaraderie the worst mother enabled, that's what I retained from our child safety and CPR class. That's what I recalled a year and a half later when Astra began to eat solid food, when we were no longer pureeing what we fed her and or mixing it with breast milk, and when she would sit at her high chair banging her sippy cup on the tray demanding uvas, uvas. When I was a child, somebody gave me a paperweight that contained within it an impossibly detailed forest scene, and when I think of the grapes, of how all the complexity of our interracial family became enfolded in the grapes, I imagine that if I had lifted one of those grapes up to the light and rotated it around, I would have perceived within it all of our family histories depicted in miniature, not just me and Elu in our own high chairs at the dawn of the 80s, our parents feeding us, but our own parents being fed in the 40s and 50s, all the way back to our respective old worlds, Kiev and San Juan, Kasha, or plantains, however mouths were sated and policed according to family and cultural custom. And if I kept rotating the grape, I'd also see Mrs. Hackett wielding her pencil of life and Mr. Hessler telling us not to practice our thrusts. All of it as intricately rendered as the shield of Achilles, or intricately rendered as Zeuxis' grapes, which were so perfectly represented in his paintings that birds tried to eat them, birds who sing from their syrinx, not their larynx, and cannot, to my knowledge, choke to death, although some can mimic human speech. When I was in charge of preparing Astra's food, I chopped everything so finely I admit I might as well have blended it or hit it with a hammer, which is not what I was supposed to be doing. I was supposed to be giving her an experience of texture, as Ilu kept pointing out. She has to learn what she likes. She has to learn to use her teeth. And since Ilu's mother was over many times a week, she often witnessed Ilu remarking that I'd inadvertently liquefied Astra's food. And of course, Ilu's mom silently sided with Ilu, forming a triangle. I was the neurotic cracker with no experience caring for children who was trying to micromanage the steamed carrots, the hot dogs, which thankfully she didn't like, and the grapes. Because Ilu's mom had taught kindergarten, I'd hoped she might share the intensity of my concern about Astra choking. Surely there had been trainings about these things, but while both Ilu and her mother were incredibly conscientious caretakers in general, so graceful and competent with Astra that I felt bumbling by comparison, and while they watched Ilu closely when she ate, the fear of her choking quickly became my thing, the worry I carried that carried all of my other worries. I would pulverize the food, and they would not quite partition it properly, which is the way of polarization. When Ilu's mom was sitting with Astra at the table, it was less that I watched over them than that my effort not to was palpable. And if Ilu or her mom were cutting something for Astra, I perceived a slight exaggeration in their gestures, a trace of performativity that said, "See how tiny these pieces are? Do we have your permission to feed her?" It was a cliche, this tension around the child's eating, but I was finding small, mortally uncut grapes in the purple plastic snack container Ilu's mom took with Astra to the park, and large grapes on the high chair that were cut but never lengthwise in any way they should be quartered. And then I'd confront Ilu about it, as if it were her fault, demanding she talk to her mom, and before we knew it, we would be having a spectacular fight, scaling up from the grapes to questions of power, labor, value, the possibility or impossibility of love, Astra crying when we yelled, or worse, taking it all silently in, blinking her large brown eyes. We'd had one such fight about a month before I choked. Aaron was behind me, his breath on my neck, trying to figure out where to put his hands. Instead of my life flashing before my eyes, a series of odors was doing whatever the olfactory equivalent of flashing is, all of them intensified by the fact that I couldn't inhale. Childhood cut grass, nothing is a cliche when you're dying, the sulfur of strike anywhere matches, asphalt after rain, fresh paint in a room whose windows are open in the spring, movie theater popcorn, the sexual smell of a woman who broke my heart in my late 20s, hyacinth, watermelon candy, maybe in the throat of Mrs. Hackett's student, my first cat, Felix, grilled peaches at my brother's in Seattle. Then, as Aaron placed his interlocking hands above my navel, they all started to coalesce around Astra, the odors, the slight soapy smell of Ilu's breast milk, of the milk on Astra's infant breath, the milky smell of Astra's shit before she started eating solid foods, the smell of her vomit on the flight back from Ponce, the smell of the baby shampoo on the wisps of her hair mixing with the cherry blossoms when I walked her through the botanical gardens in the carrier. It was all Astra now, as Aaron performed his first ineffectual thrust, tears finally in my eyes, haloing all the tabletop candles, my little aleph, little star, my asterisk, and even as my peripheral vision began to contract and my ears started to ring, and I was begging my daughter to forgive me in my mind, I was surprised, and surprised that I was surprised that in my last moments on earth, as I was flooded with terror and love, that I had the mental space to note how the world failed to conform to my expectations of it, that nobody around us in the restaurant seemed aware of what was happening. How was it possible that no waiter had appeared, that people around us were still drinking and laughing and eating and generating columns of vibrating air at their tables while Aaron did it again? How was it possible nobody was answering the phone? It was ringing in our kitchen on Jewel Street. Can someone get that? My mom was yelling. Can someone take a message, please? Because you were everyone at the tables, the dark splotches in my vision. You were the tables and the candles and cliches. Thank you. Because people might have questions. I stay up for questions, or I just stay up and you all. Look at me.
Can you talk more about what you just read? What project is it from?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's the beginning. He is saved by this guy, Aaron. I mean, clearly he's writing this thing. And, well, it's very, like, either I mean, what I have is kind of like maybe a story, but I hope it'll be something bigger. I don't know what it is still, but basically, after he's saved this guy, he wants to tell Ilu what happened, but he's also really reluctant, like he feels like it will confirm Ilu's worldview that he has choked because he expressed all this worry about choking. And then he thinks that's ridiculous, magical thinking, that's totally like unfair, but then he realizes that his worldview is that it must be like expressive in some Freudian way, which is equally magical, that like in either way he's responsible, like either it was his, and like both of those worldviews feel unavoidable and unacceptable. It's kind of like it's in my own family, the joke, is about the kind of the Puerto Rican magical thinking and the Jewish magical thinking and the different way we manage or fail to manage that around parenting in particular. So he basically decides not to tell her about the choking. And then that becomes a kind of small secret that grows, but then also it's very destabilizing for the guy who saved him, this Aaron guy. And then it's kind of like, I think it's gonna be a book about, I don't know if it's gonna be a book, but if it were to become a book, I think it would be about these different characters' versions of magical thinking. It's kind of the only thinking we have. And I also thought I had to read this because Chiku has successfully performed the Heimlich maneuver on 2 different people in the last calendar year. So, a round of applause for Chiku. But I think like I wanted like there's something about like an event that can like he doesn't have a way to think of it as contingent, and he doesn't have a way to think like he can't accept. It seems insane to think of it as purely contingent, and it seems insane to think of it as fated, and that impasse kind of spreads out in all these different ways to these other relationships. But it's very new and might go nowhere.
I love what you're doing with time. Just the way that both time and space are, like, there's the miniature, which contains everything inside of the paperweight and the uka, and there's, just the collapsing and the microscopic, like, analysis of time in this 30 seconds that took you maybe 25 minutes to read. And you mentioned the southeast corner of Union Square, and I haven't been to New York since before the pandemic, but isn't there that installation there, like time counting down? There's been an installation on the southeast corner of Union Square about time.
Yeah, I didn't think of that, but you're right, yeah.
And I was wondering whether you wrote this over the course of the pandemic, and if you could talk about what happened to time, and particularly being in an epicenter, as you may have been, I'm not sure, but like of the virus, with the constant ambulance sirens, and then the sort of nonchalance of the people around. One PS, which is completely unrelated, this whole time I've been thinking about how she could perform the like a couple of years ago before the pandemic, and I was thinking, I'm so glad I have this colleague that I can say.
It should be a named chair. That's a really beautifully framed question. I mean, I think there are two. I mean, there's like some of the truest answers are a little boring, like just the amount of time I've spent with my kids made me, I think anyway I've been thinking about writing about kids or writing about the anxiety produced with kids and the weird temporal effect of not just if you have a kid, but if you spend time with kids, it's like a bonsai effect where you're both like looking down, you're the grown-up, and suddenly you can like imagine the perspective of the grown-ups in your own childhood, but you're also like the kid again looking up, so it involves a kind of doubling of time. So I think whenever kids are anywhere in the writing for me, that starts to happen. The other thing about the kind of historical moment is that I think that and this is a little bit less about time, but it's about writing at this time, right? Is that I feel like never, like I've totally lost the thread about what's like scientific and what's religious at this point. Like when do I wear my mask and how do I wear my mask? And like, is the nasal swab a kind of like ritual, or like, is it actually going to detect new variant? Like I've seen, like, so I wanted to write something, or I don't even know if I wanted to, but I found myself writing something that, without being set in the time of the pandemic, in the second part of this, that when he's kind of thinking about what happened, this comes up a lot, is kind of like risk as a metaphysics, and not really having confidence in the like scientificity of risk management. There are just like the two ways to manage risk in his family are to speak the risks as a kind of like negative prayer, and it's like prophylactic, or like her opinion, which is that if you speak the risks, you bring them about, and that actually has a lot to do with making wildly inconsistent, but like trying to think out all these decisions about like what one does or doesn't do in the midst of the pandemic, and to think about, but to write that without it being set in the pandemic, because I think if I were writing in the present, I think it would, in the pure present, it wouldn't be possible for me. But I also think that I've, like, in poetry too, like what the thing about like that passage, that canonical example of the phrases where it has, Achilles' shield. Like I love how it's like the description of the shield, but really it's like this impossible amount of detail that goes on forever. So really it's like poetry or narrative's capacity to depict something that couldn't really be depicted in a material object, so that some of the things literature can do with time are really foundational for me, as they are for so many. And I think it's that plus the weird miniaturization having a child is that have produced some of the temporal relations in this thing so far.
So I just read this in school, and I'm thinking a lot about your history of accepting speech. That's something you also have done. Not concise, but I'm curious about how that skill of like speaking well on any topic, like, relates to your actual process of writing, and then where it like really specifically is different, like the process of like whether that informs your ability to like generate new writing, like how it informs it, and then also words.
It's a good extemporaneous speaking was this like high school competitive event where you like draw a topic out of a hat, and then you have like 30 minutes to prepare a 5 to 7 minute speech that you don't know anything about, but you pretend. Maybe some people knew what they were talking about or whatever, but that didn't seem like the point of the activity. I just want to say in passing that there's this really weird, when I was just thinking about, I get really nervous when I have to read something that's written, and I don't get nervous at all when I'm just speaking, which I think is maybe the opposite for most people. I don't know, but I always think I'm like hyperventilating when I'm reading on paper. I just think a weird psychic legacy of it is I'm just more comfortable like listening to myself speak and see what I'm saying than actually having to like inhabit what I've written down, but whatever. But I think that I think the utopian moment in extemporaneous speaking for me was the not knowing. Like it was the way that it was a fraudulent activity for me, because it was all about like discovering what might be sayable in the act of speaking, and that to me really feels like literary composition, and so that there was a way that it was more of a projectivist verse than certainly than it was like scholastic and substantial about like issues like here was my solution to the problems in the Middle East, you know. So I think that I do think that there was a weird way, and this kind of comes up in that novel, that some of those debate and forensics exercises that were, for me, were quite like scary and weird too, and brought out like a lot of the worst in me, also sometimes met like a kind of experimental poetry in a very unpredictable way, like the stretching of language through speed in the fast debate, or that idea of just being like in the flow of language when you have to like stand up and deploy these affects as if you knew what you were saying, but actually a lot of it is shaped sound, you know. So that's all there in my like education or miseducation. But I think when I'm writing, I think that I often like there's like it feels extemporaneous, but that's such an early moment in the prose. Like there's so much of the things that I discover are later, are like once I have the material to work with. That's where so much of the artistry is, that it doesn't feel, no part of it feels extemporaneous, even the depiction of the extemporaneous. But I do think I do think that like the discovering what you say in the act of speaking, and maybe even the idea that that's like fraudulent, like so much of my work is about fraudulence too, that flow is always like a failure to actually be knowledgeable in an adult way. Like it's always a kind of passing, but then at the same time that it's like exciting. I think that's there. And then this weird thing I haven't figured out where like I can barely read what's written down without panicking, but I could talk relatively comfortably in front of people for a long time. It's a strange inversion, I think.
I have a sort of broad question, but this could just be projection on my part. You seem to be a writer who's really devoted to kind of exploring the current condition or modern dynamics. So like even something like Poetic School, which is obviously set primarily in the mid-90s, a lot of it seems to be kind of looking at modern situations and dynamics through the prism of the past. Is that kind of something that you're conscious of? In any way, or is it just naturally kind of evoking in your work?
Well, I don't know exactly what it would mean to not do a version of that, but certainly the way that like novels have become writable for me, which it's like, I don't even mean that as like the category of good. I just mean like it's writable for me. Is like some conjunction, like two moments in relation, like not just like the 90s, but the 90s remembered, but the kind of like end of history narratives of a certain pundit class remembered from the Trump era, but then also the kind of baby boomers of the 90s, like so me remembering that discourse of the 90s and then depicting the memory of the 50s and 60s from the parents of the 90s. Like there's some constellation of historical periods that's only, you know, of novelistic interest if it's filtered through characters and situations, right, that feel alive. But definitely that idea of like trying to depict a historical constellation at a felt scale seems to me to be how, like one thing a novel might do, and that patterning more than plotting is usually how I think about how to write. But like this, I mean, I think like I'm also like a really like, you know, I'm still kind of confused by it because it wasn't like how I thought of myself. But like I'm like, turns out like I'm just like really interested in intergenerational family transmission. You know, too, like and the way that is shot through with larger historical process, the way voices are intergenerational technologies, like the way having a kid suddenly stages these, brings out for the characters in this thing I may or may not be able to write, both the complexity of an interracial relationship in the present, but like puts them in touch with, like Ilu is an ethnographer. I mean, my wife is an ethnographer, but Ilu also is a kind of different kind of ethnographer, but like she both studies modes of thought that are not considered strictly rational, whatever that means, but her relationship to that work, at least as I depict it, is very much that she both respects those different orders of thinking and notions of causality and sympathies, and wants to disavow it. And that there's a drama of repetition and mastery in her relation to that stuff that's about a long past and her own, you know. So, and where in the fiction making of this narrator is kind of similar, like this ancient poetic belief in the incantatory power of language that he also wants to disavow. So I guess, I mean, I think that novels are, I mean, I don't know what novels are, but I like to think that the prose is a kind of scaling device where those abstract processes are made feelable, but then also the local conditions are dissolved back into some gesture towards a historical rhythm, and that it's kind of that contraction and dilation that's the novelistic equivalent of prosody or something that attracts me. Or it's when I feel I can go on, I feel like some version of that is happening.
I'm curious about the role of humor in the piece you read. You so effortlessly combine humor with this like morbid subject of choking, and I'm curious how you view the function of humor and the ways in which you choose to include it in your writing.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like my last book was not funny enough. Like I actually, and I mean that like there's like kind of like artistic failure. Like, because it should have been the most, in fact, like I always thought like I have this great like the funny, like the novel I write about like me as a teenager was gonna be like, it's gonna be really, really funny. But I couldn't figure out how to write, it like wasn't the place I was at, but also like it became more urgent in the artwork to actually take seriously aspects of what was like clearly a kind of abject experience. So more and more I felt like the work I had to do is actually say like, of course these white kids freestyling is like gross and embarrassing in every way, but there's some other glimmer of possibility in it. And I was so committed, I mean, I hope there's some funny things in the book, right? But I was like so committed to writing, to like rescuing a little glimmer of possibility from these busted modes that somehow it wasn't, I didn't figure out how to do that and capture the humor as much as I would want, but I think choking, I mean, I did, this was not what choking was like for me, but I was choking and someone saved me. And the funny thing about it is like you tell, like, it's all kind of funny and embarrassing, and it's like it's all, I mean, I'm not saying it's funny to like lose someone in this horrible way. What I mean to say is like shame is so deeply caught up. You know, like I have a friend from New Orleans who told me this horrible story about like a really beloved doctor in the community who had a retirement party, and it was full of doctors, and he was eating, you know, up on the like a raised table or whatever, and he started to choke, and he was so humiliated that he just like left, you know, to try to do it himself or whatever, and like didn't make it. Like there is like shame, and then if you do make it, right, then it's kind of like I mean, I don't mean funny, like I don't want to make fun of it, like it was horrifying, but I'm just saying it is caught up in all this shame and embarrassment, and always kind of feels like a nightmarish comedy. So I think I'm drawn to the way that it's funny and not funny, right? And that the ways that it's funny really think I have to do with how closely related choking is to speech, like as I say, like just like how it really happens at this boundary between mere body and the possibility of generating the social world of language. And then after I choked, I couldn't go to a restaurant for a while, not because, I mean like a week, not because, but not because I was like, I thought I was gonna choke, although I'm like horrified of choking, and now I think that I'm gonna choke to death for writing this. Like I'm like worried about that actively, but at least Chiku's here. So what happened tonight? But I just like, I started to see restaurants as like, I mean, in this like kind of defamiliarized way as these bizarre theaters of like speech alternating with eating. Like you go to this place to perform, to like show everyone that you are capable of like talking and then eating and then talking, you know? And it doesn't always work out, actually. You know, like it's quite like, you know, it's quite so the comedy of it to me is the comedy that I think I'm drawn to is comedy that I feel like is funny and then not funny as you read, right? And that the, you know, just textually or whatever, I think if a piece of writing can be funny and make you do something like laugh, you know, to basically involuntarily expel air from the body, it also somatizes the reading in a different way. Like, I think it makes it more of a, I mean, I think when things are quite funny, I think they do intensify the embodied experience of reading, which is obviously, you know, thematic here. But I also just, I mean, it's just, I had to try to write something that felt like funny and absurd and not just like for all the right things and against all the wrong things and just like, you know, committed to all the reasons to despair in the present, although it's also full of all that stuff too, you know.
Yeah, so I had a question kind of prompted by Jen's question about the corner of Union Square, about the way the setting works in your fiction. I guess as like context, I grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, and there's that scene in school where Adam walks into Lawrence at like 4 a.m. and like there's something that he got so right about what Lawrence is like at that moment. And so I'm wondering, like, and it's not just you go buildings in the right order. There's like something that you capture, and I guess like how that sort of scene would work, and then the way that like Cafe Lou becomes this kind of hyperspace in what you read tonight. And so I guess the question is just like thoughts about setting, but
yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the fiction I love, or like, you know, I mean, I don't know if this is like I think, so the true answer is that I think I'm drawn to settings that are more than one setting at once, right? Like, so in that guy's like walk into Lawrence and past Stull and like in that landscape, which is very much like a real place that you and I know, I was also tipping in lines from John Clare and his walk from, you know, the mental hospital, this beautiful piece of prose he wrote about going to find his beloved or whatever. So I wanted like to be looking at the landscape, but also like thinking about this, you know, poet exiled by the enclosure or whatever, and to figure out so that it's the literal space and it's not. And I think the pleasure for me in reading or writing that way is because that's what reading is, right? It's like you see the setting, but it's not the setting, it's the words on the page. And so I think that doubling to me is actually a way of kind of like, again, vivifying the process of reading, you know? And so like Cafe Lou to be like a hyperspace, as you put it, like he's at his table, but he can also be at his desk in Mrs. Hackett's class. Like it's not just the dissolve of the scenes, it's also that to me, like that process of dissolve is actually a way of bringing you back to the materiality of language too. Like this is the weird time travel and method of conveyance that just is reading and is writing. So I mean, when I was like first, the way that a lot of like, the way self-reference was talked about in fiction when I was like a student was this kind of postmodern, playful demonstration of like this idea that there was nothing outside the text and that it was all just like, you know, a tissue of signs or whatever. But I think because I maybe grew up more with like models of poetic construction, where like self-consciousness about constructiveness isn't, that is a realism, like this thing in your hand that's made out of words, you know, that is a made thing. You have to, you feel its materiality, and part of the way you feel its materiality is when there are allegories of reading in the text, that the story both advances, but like the change in space or the layering of different kinds of time also remind you of the weird technology writing is. Does that make sense? So I think, and I think like related to that is that setting, which is not a word I've thought about that, but I mean, I think like fiction is like media history, you know? So for me, it's like, what's this, how does information circulate through the space if there's a landline versus a cell phone? Like how do different technologies structure experiences of time or space, right? I mean, there's not that much of that here, although I think the grape that's also a marble, that's also the shield of Achilles, like that isn't another instance of that. So I don't know, but I think that when I feel like it works, I feel like it's both particular and doubled, and then that actually vivifies the experience of reading, where it's both words on the page and the realm of reference of the story that's being told.
I just want to piggyback off that pretty well, actually. I'm wondering so you mentioned that your backup was these prose poems, and actually the last time I saw you read, you were 1004 was just about to come out, and you did read prose poems. But I'm wondering what your relationship is now to the poetic line, the line break, and whether it feels to you like you're just interested in something else now, or whether it feels like an avoidance relationship, or what is it? Are you not writing poems where the lines break for a reason, or does it feel like...
No, well, I am writing poems where the lines break, but I can't. But I'm in some kind of crisis about what the book of poems is right now. So I have all these pages of poems, but I don't. The relation between them isn't work. And then I thought these prose poems, it was going to be that these prose poems were going to be interleaved with those lineated sequences, and then that was like they were going to both be improved by that That's always my fantasy, is that like if I do two things I don't like, I'll then figure out a relationship between them. Like. But I do have, and there's actually like one mode of lineation in particular that I'm kind of like wrestling with, where, this may be true of the prose poems too, where I'm trying to think of a kind of disjunction that is not, that's kind of the opposite of I've been thinking about this for a long time, and it's hardly just my idea, but so much of my understanding of disjunction was formed in the discourse of like language poetry, and it being kind of subtractive and deconstructive. And I've been more interested in how it can be emotive and mimetic of consciousness, even one consciousness that's of course always shot through with all these other forces. So anyway, I do have these lineated poems. But I think these prose poems, they're a collaboration with this artist, so that the relevant kind of enjambment for me is between the visual art and the prose. I do think in the prose poems, what I'm interested in is sentences returning with a difference in different contexts, and also this kind of fading in and out of narrative, where sometimes it's really about like sound patterning of language that reads kind of like new sentence non sequitur, but then that same language returns in a narrative context. And I was kind of thinking about that in relation to this artist's work as a kind of, sometimes it's paint and sometimes you see depicted space, like a movement between materiality and like the diegesis of her work or something. So, yeah, but I don't have there's something I can't figure out about the book of poems, and I don't even have an interesting version of the problem. I'm just still, and I don't know if it's really about the form. I don't know if it's about, like, I don't know if maybe it's been a long time since I've published a book of poems, and like I tend to work in threes for indefensible, like it's not a decision. I have 3 books of poems and 3 novels, and now I don't know what comes next. I don't know what it is. Tell me if you but no, I'm not, and I think it's possible that in this thing, some poems might appear. I have this like kind of dim fantasy about it. Some lineated poems might appear, but I'm not sure. Like I think for me, like the prose poem, like the thing about the prose poem can mean a lot of different things. But I think what I tend to do is it's like I'm interested in the frame, like in the ambiguity of the frame of positioning something as a prose poem or writing something that's a space where you can have effects that might normally be associated with verse, but then you can also perform these other tasks that are like essayistic or whatever. And I think like some of them, so I think that they're experiments in different genres that might be more prosaic, but they're not necessarily, I'm calling them prose poems, but like some are kind of like voicemails, for example, and it's not really, or they flirt with that genre, or one kind of pretends to be an audio tour. So I think that I kind of associate the prose poem with this kind of laboratory for different like genre experiments, but that are interestingly positioned against like the felt absence of lineation, right? Like when it's called a prose poem, it's kind of like why did poetry go missing? But how is poetry? How is the verse that the prose poems don't present still a present absence in the work? And that, to me, and a lot of the prose poems I love, I mean, very like traditional prose poems, but also more recent prose poems, like that the inviting someone, the welcome pressure on the prose to be haunted by the unavailability of verse. Like that just seems like, for whatever reason, like whatever's motivating that unavailability, that to me seems really kind of interesting as a pressure. And then I think with fiction, the fiction that I've written, like there's something, what I like about it is how it can absorb all these other genres, not like just absorb them and become, like baggy or whatever, but create a constellation between like an essay and a poem and a more personal narrative or whatever. And that, the one thing I would just say, like in relation to the novel, what I think is common though about kind of like the question of interpretation in relation to both of them is I'm very interested in dramas of recontextualization in both those forms, right? So like how, when I say like a line returns with a difference and it's the same line has a totally different sense when it comes to another moment of the prose poem, like that drama of recontextualization, which is so much of the visual arts is interested in that, right? I mean, that is like the ready-made, it's many other things, right? But in the fiction, I tend to really kind of like narrate that. Like what happened to this grape as a result of this dynamic? What was it like to look at this grape as a result of that dynamic? Or in the other novels, it's often actually looking at works of art or like a commodity in a supermarket. And that to be able to describe to be able to invite a reader to look differently at something with you, which is all kinds of different writing does that, right? Like that's what great criticism does, right? But from the way I feel most able to do that is through dramas of recontextualization in the frame of this thing called the novel or fiction. So it's about like calibrating the different pressures of interpretation and bringing them into the work, I think. Yeah. Thank you guys very much.